The Mishnah Megillah on Daf Chaf Aleph tells us how many aliyahs there are at different times. So, for example, Monday, Thursday, Shabbos, Mincha, we have 3 aliyahs. Chodesh Chol Hamoed, we have 4 aliyahs. Yantif, we have 5 aliyahs. Yom Kippurim, 6 aliyahs. Shabbos, 7 aliyahs. You're never allowed to make fewer aliyahs than the prescribed amounts. However, under certain circumstances, you can add aliyahs. You can have hasafas. Can't do so during the weekday. That would be considered to be a tircha de tzibura. That would be too much of an imposition on people. People have to get to work. But at other times, it sounds like it is permitted to have hasafas, to add aliyahs. The Ran points out that there's a pecking order, there's a hierarchy, and that each of the times where there's a set number of aliyos, it's a stage in terms of the level of kedusha. So a weekday has less kedusha than Chol Hamoed. Chol Hamoed has less kedusha than Yantiv. Yantiv less than Yom Kippurim. Yom Kippurim less than Shavuos, less than Shabbos. So if you added, for example, an aliyah, a Chol Hamoed, instead of 4 aliyahs, you had 5 aliyahs. So the Ran writes, then it would look the same as Yantiv, and therefore you can't have a suffix at any time other than on Shabbos. And that's the more generally accepted approach. That we don't add a suffix except on Shabbos. On Shabbos, there are certain parameters, but you can have additional aliyahs. 10 pages later, the same Gemara in Masechta Megillah, the Mishnah on Daf Lamed Aleph, tells us, yeah, very nice that you could add aliyahs, you could have a suffix, but when it comes to the Tochacha, which we read this Shabbos, the admonition, so then you're not allowed to add any aliyahs. One person has to read all of it. There has to be one aliyah for all of the Tochacha. And that's in fact our practice. Why is that? So in the Gemara we find 2 opinions. Reish Lakish says, because Ein Omer Bracha al Peranios, we don't recite a bracha, a blessing over calamities. And if you added in an aliyah, what you're basically doing is you're requiring somebody to make an additional set of blessings before and after on that which is bad, on that which is terrible. The Tochacha, should be pointed out, has, at the beginning and the end, components of that which is good. But if you had a safa and you put it straight in the middle of the Tochacha, so then a person could be reading psukim that are entirely bad. So he says that Ein Omer Bracha al Peranios, we don't add any asafas during the Tochacha. But Rav Chiya bar Gamda, in the name of Rav Asi, he gives a different explanation. He says on the basis of a pasuk in Mishlei, a verse in Proverbs, that the pasuk says that Bini Musar Hashem al Timas, my son, the reproach of Hashem you shall not detest. In other words, if Hashem is giving us musar, if he's telling us what we're doing wrong, he's saying, as they would say in Yiddish, strafreden, you don't interrupt. Why don't we interrupt? What would be so bad if we interrupted? Interrupting is more harmful and more dangerous than we realize. It's very important to develop the skill of learning to listen, even when you're being told things that you don't want to hear. Maybe especially at such times, it's important to learn to listen without interruption. Psychologist Marty Nemko has written extensively about this subject, and he's made a number of important observations. When a person is an interrupter, they become very tense because they feel they have to interrupt. They have to say something. They have to react. They have to respond. A person who interrupts really denies themselves the opportunity to gather their thoughts because they don't really hear the end of what somebody has to say and they can't consider the totality of the statement. If a person interrupts, they also lose the chance to really hear what somebody else has to say. And you know what? You might actually learn something from another person. And in fact, They might have a point that undercuts whatever counter argument you feel you need to stick in there. But beyond that, a person who interrupts comes across as being very rude. And not only that, a person who interrupts looks as if they are very egotistical. My opinion is more important than yours, and even though you're talking, I'm going to interrupt because I'm greater than you. So I can interrupt. A person who interrupts also looks very uncontrollable. Can't you just be quiet for 2 minutes? Let somebody speak without interrupting. So, interrupting is not a good thing. And my sense is that because of the world that we live in, and where there's so much that's struggling to get our attention, we are constantly receiving WhatsApps, text messages, news has tickers running across. Every time you open up a website, there are so many different pop-ups. Everyone and everything is screaming for our attention. And so we've become trained that we too have to scream and interrupt to get attention. And it's a terrible thing. God forbid we don't understand the terrible tragedy that we're still reeling from in Meron. But imagine for a moment if it were possible. And I'm not saying that it was. But imagine those people who were tending to a heart attack victim in this very narrow tunnel. If everybody had listened and backed off and just waited, what kind of a tragedy could have been averted? The over 600 people that this week are observing Avelos wouldn't be doing so. And to some extent, it happened because people interrupted. People interrupted speech, and certainly people interrupted the direction that other people were walking in, and unfortunately, 45 people were crushed to death. There's too much interrupting. I see it all the time in conversations, sadly. How often does it happen in shul that people are davening and someone else comes over to actually interrupt, to begin a conversation? And I think people are very interrupting when Hashem speaks. Do we really pay the closest attention to the reading of the Torah? Do we really, really allow ourselves to focus so that we can hear in an uninterrupted way? I wonder a little bit. Maybe part of the Tochacha is to teach us just how important it is not to interrupt. And maybe, if we don't interrupt, and maybe if we are more sensitive to others when they are speaking, maybe Hashem will hear our prayers in an uninterrupted fashion. Good Shabbos.